This has been a journey of discovery for me. I knew the story of fugitive slaves crossing at Windsor and the strength of the Black community around Chatham, Ontario. But despite having grown up in Niagara, I didn't know that Fort Erie, in particular, was actually one of the main ports of entry for slaves fleeing the United States as early as the 1790s. It does not surprise me, having worked on this sermon, that we weren't taught anything about the presence of what historians call fugitive slaves coming and living in Niagara. And come they did, in such numbers that during the War of 1812, there was an entire regiment made up of Black soldiers from Niagara, known as the Colored Corps. And they were widely heralded as one of the key parts of our victories over the Americans. The largest influx of fugitive slaves into Niagara, and indeed into Canada, occurred after the U.S. passed a bill called the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, which allowed slave owners in the southern states where slavery was legal to come north to the free states and recapture their runaway slaves. In the very first month after the passage of that bill, 3,000 fugitive slaves crossed into Canada. And in the next decade, historians believe that as many as 30,000 fugitive slaves came to what was then Upper Canada, or Ontario. And my journey of discovery continued when I read one account that said that after 1850, every village in Niagara, every village, had fugitive slaves present. So I went back to the sort of official three histories that have been written about the village where I grew up, Smithville in South Grimsby Township in Lincoln County. And friends, there is not a single word about fugitive slaves. And yet, I would assume one could believe that fugitive slaves who came and called Smithville home, they likely worked in the foundry in the village, in the large brewery that was established there, in the creamery, or on the many farms which needed laborers. They are simply missing from the history, likely because the dominant group wrote it and discounted their presence. And so Russ is now going to show us a couple of photos of both of Harriett Tubman and of Salem Chapel in St. Catharines, which Lisa so wonderfully mentioned in her story this morning. And there we have a photo of Harriett. And there's a photo of Salem Chapel in St. Catharines. Thanks, Russ. There were so many fugitive slaves in towns like St. Catharines that they formed their own Methodist church, which was called the Salem Chapel, and that was as early as 1820. Salem later became, after the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, the very heart, the very home of the Underground Railway and of its great hero, as you heard, Harriett Tubman. And for many, the Niagara River was the biblical River Jordan. And in African American spirituals, the word promised land or heaven was a code for saying, I'm going north to Canada. And I confess, having grown up there until last month, I had never heard anyone in Niagara mention the Salem Chapel. And yet, it is one of two National Historic Sites in Niagara dedicated to the arrival of fugitive slaves in Upper Canada. And then my learning continued. The first Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada was John Graves Simcoe, who we ostensibly celebrate in some parts of Ontario on the August long weekend. Well, Simcoe came to Upper Canada as a prophetic voice for the abolition of slavery in the British Empire. He had been one of the few MPs in the British House of Commons to vote for its abolition. While he was Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, a report came to Simcoe in 1793 of the forced sale of a young black woman by the name of Chloe Cooley, who was sold by her owner to a slave owner in New York State. Some reports suggest that she was bound and that she was screaming in the boat as she was taken back to the U.S. across the Niagara River. Simcoe was incensed, and he had a bill proclaimed in the Upper Canada Legislative Assembly which forbid the purchase or the sale of slaves and automatically freed all slaves when they reached the age of 25. It was the first such legislation in the entire British Empire, which itself did not abolish slavery until 1833. So when a fugitive slave crossed into Canada, they were given all the rights and the privileges of British citizenship, which included the right to vote, the right to own land, rights which were unheard of in many of the states in the U.S. from which they had fled. And at first, the churches in Niagara kind of treated the fugitive slaves in a missionary style. But these new citizens, as one might imagine, preferred a more lively form of worship from their British counterparts. And so they formed, early on, African Methodist Episcopal Church congregations. And they were familiar to slaves who were coming across. And many of them still thrive here in Ontario. You can find one, for example, on Gerrard Street East in downtown Toronto. Well, the Salem Chapel, the picture of which you saw just earlier in St. Catharines, was almost the mother home of AME denomination. And it was there that one remarkable woman, Harriett Tubman, made her home. Tubman's heroics really began with the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850. Tubman became, as you heard, one of the most heralded conductors on the Underground Railway. As the St. Catharines Standard said of her, "There is tough, and there is Harriett Tubman tough." Over the course of 7 years, Harriett brought 300 fugitive slaves from the U.S., traveling at night, traveling between the stations or safe houses, and then crossing the Niagara River with her precious cargo to new freedom. Tubman's ability to free slaves was so renowned that Southern slave owners offered an incredible $40,000 bounty on her head, dead or alive, which in today's equivalent would be $1.2 million. And why did Tubman do this? Why did she take all of these risks? It was because all agreed that she had a passionate faith in Jesus Christ. She believed that God had called her to this mission and that risking her life for the sake of others was in the same fashion as bearing the cross of Jesus. She had, it is said, a strong faith in the biblical stories of deliverance of God's people out of captivity, be it in Egypt or in Babylon. And she was but one of the prophets bringing the faithful into the promised land. And Salem Chapel in St. Catharines was her terminus. It was here that she brought the first fugitive slaves to be cared for by the community. Now, many stayed in Niagara, more moved on to Hamilton and Brantford, and many, in fact, most landed in Toronto, according to the census. And what I realized in my journey of discovery was that the church was much more than a place of Sunday morning worship for the fugitive slaves who arrived here in Upper Canada. Hundreds of AME congregations were established, and every one of them was like the Salem Chapel, the very heart, the very soul of the African Canadian community. As one historian notes, they were the cornerstone of the community. They were the spiritual, the social, the educational, and the church was fundamental to the Black experience in Upper Canada. It's really why I chose that passage which Ellen read for us this morning from Acts, because it describes the early church in a way in which everyone shared with those who were in need. No one went wanting. Everyone was held up by the community. They broke bread together, and they praised God for the goodness of all people. And it surely must have been like that for those fugitive slaves who really risked their lives to escape slavery and who crossed that river to freedom in Upper Canada. And where did they find a community that would welcome them in, would hold them up, would give them the tools and the strength and the courage to thrive in the promised land? They found it in the church, in those who followed Jesus. It's an image of church that I want to hold up for us today as a beacon of light in the turmoil of the world's ways. The church is a community which finds strength in each other's presence. When the fugitive slaves crossed the river, they found in places like the Salem Chapel a home for their faith and social and economic support. It was as if these congregations had a searchlight on their steeples, which shone through the night, across the river, across the lake, and called out, "Freedom here, new hope here, new life here." So friends, may we become that beacon of Christ's light in our world, offering hope, offering refuge, and offering true freedom to all. May God be our guide. Amen.